The call came from a lawyer in Grants, New Mexico, a woman named Priscilla Hatch who introduced herself twice before I understood why she was calling, and even then I asked her to repeat it a third time, because none of it made sense to me. My Uncle Frank was dead. He had been dead for 6 days by the time anyone thought to track me down, found by a neighbor who noticed his dog had been barking at the porch for 2 days straight and finally drove out to check on him. Frank Voss and I had not spoken in 11 years, not since my father's funeral, where the two of them had gotten into something ugly over money that neither of us ever fully explained to me afterward, and I had grown up thinking of him as a name more than a person, a photograph on my father's mantle of two brothers standing in front of a truck neither of them could afford. I had not expected to hear from him again, alive or dead, and I certainly had not expected to hear that he had left me his ranch, 640 acres outside a town called Piedra Seca, tucked against the Zuni Mountains not far from the Rama Navajo community, along with $43,000 in feed store debt, $11,000 in back taxes, and a herd of 60 head of cattle that, according to Priscilla Hatch, nobody currently had the time or the money to feed. I sat in my kitchen in Tucson, holding the phone against my ear for a long time after she finished talking, staring at the stack of medical bills still sitting on the counter from Laura's treatment, bills that had followed me around like a second shadow for the 2 years since she died, and I did the math without meaning to. Even after the debt, even after the taxes, a working cattle ranch in Catron County was worth more than I would see from teaching shop class for the next decade combined. I told Priscilla Hatch I needed a few days to think about it. She told me the cattle didn't have a few days. Laura and I had been married 9 years when the diagnosis came, and the 18 months after that had drained through our savings the way water drains through sand, quietly and completely, until there was nothing left to show for either the money or the effort except a folder of bills I couldn't bring myself to throw away and couldn't bring myself to keep paying down either. I had gone back to teaching after the funeral because it was the only structure I had left, showing up to a classroom full of teenagers who didn't know or care that I'd spent the previous 2 years learning more about oncology than I'd ever wanted to know, and most nights I came home to an apartment that still had her handwriting on a grocery list stuck to the refrigerator because I couldn't make myself take it down. I had gotten very good, in those 2 years, at building a life that looked functional from the outside, while feeling, from the inside, like a house with all the furniture pushed up against doors that no longer opened. Laura had been the one who wanted a piece of land someday. Actually, some small acreage outside the city where she could keep chickens and a garden that didn't depend on borrowed water. And in the last months of her treatment, when we both knew more than we said out loud about how things were likely to end, she used to describe that imaginary place to me in detail while I sat beside her hospital bed, the color she wanted to paint the kitchen, the dog she wanted to get once she was well enough, a whole life neither of us ever got to build together. I had not thought about that particular daydream in a long time by the day Priscilla Hatch called, and it was only much later driving north through the mazes with the truck loaded down under its blue tarp that I let myself notice how closely the Bar V matched the picture Laura used to paint from that hospital bed, down to the wide sky and the quiet and the distance from anything resembling a city, and I have never quite decided whether that made moving there feel more like an honor to her memory or more like a wound I kept reopening on purpose. So when Priscilla Hatch called with an inheritance that came with debt attached, I understood on some level that I wasn't just looking at a piece of real estate. I was looking at a reason to leave a city that had become a museum of my own grief, and I said yes to the ranch faster than any reasonable person should have, packing everything I owned into the bed of my truck under a blue tarp before I had even seen a single photograph of the place beyond the one Priscilla emailed me, a low adobe house sitting under a sky so wide it looked fake. I gave notice at the school on a Monday and was on the road by that Thursday, telling myself the whole drive that this was a fresh start rather than a retreat, though I suspect now it was both. My sister Denise called me twice while I was still packing the truck, and both times she asked me the same question in a different way. You're moving to a town you've never seen, to live in a house that belonged to a man you haven't spoken to in 11 years, to raise cattle you've never touched in your life, she said, and I could hear her pacing on the other end, the way she always did when she was working herself up to something. I'm not raising them, I told her. I'm selling them along with the land as soon as I get the debt paid down enough that a buyer doesn't run the other way. That's the plan, at least. Denise was quiet for a second. "And if it isn't that simple," she said, "it's 600 acres in the middle of nowhere." "Denise," I said, trying to sound more certain than I felt, "what could possibly not be simple about it?" She didn't have an answer for that. Not one she was willing to say out loud, and she made me promise to send her the address and to call her every Sunday, a promise I intended to keep and mostly did, at least in the beginning. She also made me promise, half joking in the way she did when she was actually completely serious, that if I found myself sitting alone in a strange house on strange land talking myself into believing something was wrong, I would call her before I called anyone else, and I told her that was a ridiculous thing to worry about, that the biggest danger waiting for me in Catron County was probably a flat tire. I didn't think about her question again until I was 3 hours into the drive, watching the saguaros give way to juniper, and then to the long red mesas of western New Mexico, and something about the emptiness out there, mile after mile of scrub grass and volcanic rock without another car in sight, made her words sit differently in my chest than they had in my kitchen. Petersika turned out to be smaller than I expected. A single main street with a gas station, a feed store, a diner called the Laureate, and a Baptist church, the whole town home to maybe 400 people according to the sign at its edge, most of them ranching families who had been out there for 3 or 4 generations. The Bar V Ranch sat 11 miles north of town on a dirt road that turned to washboard the last 2 miles. The house itself older than I expected, adobe walls 1.5 feet thick that Frank's grandfather had built by hand in the 1920s, a barn behind it that leaned slightly to the west, and beyond both of them, fencing that ran out toward the tree line where the land started climbing into the foothills of the Zuni Mountains. I stood in the yard the first evening with the sun going down behind the mountains, the whole sky turning the color of a healing bruise, and felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, like I had made a decision that might actually work out. The house itself smelled like dust and old wood smoke, and it took me most of that first night just to find where Frank had kept the fuse box, working by phone flashlight through a mudroom stacked with saddles and coiled rope and a rifle cabinet with a broken lock. I let myself sit with that first good feeling for exactly 11 days before the first thing happened that made me question it. The first person I met besides Priscilla Hatch was a man named Ronald Yazzie, who showed up at the ranch on my second morning without calling first, driving an old Ford with a dog crate welded into the bed and a rifle rack that was empty. He introduced himself as Frank's neighbor, though when I asked how far away his place was, he said 40 minutes, which told me something about what neighbor meant out here. Ronald was somewhere in his 60s, built like a man who had spent his whole life outdoors, with a quiet, careful way of talking that made me lean in without meaning to. He'd helped Frank with the herd for going on 15 years, he told me, mostly during branding and shipping season, and he'd come out because he heard through the grapevine that Frank's nephew had inherited the place, and he wanted to see for himself whether I intended to keep the cattle alive or let them starve while I figured out my next move. I told him I planned to keep the operation running just long enough to sell it as a working ranch instead of raw land, since a working ranch would fetch a better price, and he nodded slowly like that was an answer he'd heard before from other people in other circumstances. He offered to keep helping through the season for the same rate Frank had paid him, $25 an hour plus fuel, and I agreed without much thought because I did not know the first thing about moving 60 head of cattle from one pasture to another, and I suspected I was going to need him for considerably more than that. He spent that first morning walking the property with me, pointing out which sections of fence needed work, which stretch of the creek still ran in a dry summer, and which 2 of the 60 cattle had a habit of pushing through gates that weren't latched properly. Before he left that first day, standing by his truck with one hand on the door, he looked past me toward the tree line to the north and asked, almost as an afterthought, whether Frank had ever mentioned anything strange about the north pasture. I told him no, that Frank and I hadn't spoken in over a decade, that I barely knew the man at all. Ronald nodded again, that same slow nod, and said only that I should keep the cattle out of the north pasture after dark if I could help it, that Frank always had, and then he got in his truck and left before I could ask him what he meant. I spent my first 2 weeks at the Bar V, learning the shape of the place the way you learn a new language, slowly and by making mistakes. I learned which gates stuck and needed to be lifted at an angle, learned that the well pump cut out if you ran the washing machine and the shower at the same time. learned the names of the 60 head of cattle. Since Ronald had already given most of them names Frank apparently never bothered to use, I woke every morning before dawn out of habit, more than necessity, made coffee on a stove with 2 working burners, and spent my days fixing fence and hauling feed, and slowly, gradually, feeling something in me that had been clenched tight since Laura died begin to loosen in the open air. I spent my evenings going through Frank's paperwork at the kitchen table, a task that turned out to be more depressing than I expected, because the deeper I got into it, the clearer it became that Frank hadn't been managing the ranch so much as slowly losing a fight with it for years. There were unpaid feed bills going back to 2019, a stack of letters from the bank about a loan he'd taken against the land itself, and a folder of veterinary invoices for cattle that had died of causes the vet had simply written down as unknown. I found, tucked behind the invoices, a smaller notebook with a cracked leather cover that I almost didn't open, assuming it was another ledger. But when I flipped it open, I found Frank's handwriting filling page after page with entries that weren't about money at all. The earliest ones were dated 8 years back and read like a rancher's ordinary complaints. 3 had lost to something in the north pasture, tracks found near the stock tank that didn't match anything he recognized. Dog wouldn't go past the fence line for 2 days running. I read maybe a dozen entries before I closed the notebook and set it aside, telling myself it was just an old man's superstitions about coyotes and mountain lions, the kind of thing any rancher out here probably wrote down after a bad season and went to bed without giving it much more thought. I would think about it a great deal more before the month was out. The first sign that something was actually wrong came 11 days after I arrived, on a morning so ordinary, I remember being annoyed about it, because I'd overslept and had to skip breakfast to get out to the pasture before the heat set in. I found 3 of the calves standing at the far fence line bawling, and when I got closer I saw why. A yearling steer lay on its side in the grass, and even from 30 feet away I could tell something was badly wrong with it, because there was almost no blood anywhere around the body despite the wound in its throat, a clean, deep gash that looked less like a bite and more like something had opened it with a single deliberate motion. I called Ronald before I even finished walking the fence line, and he was there within the hour, kneeling beside the carcass with an expression I couldn't quite read, running his fingers along the edge of the wound without touching it directly. "Coyotes don't do this," he said finally, standing up and wiping his hands on his jeans even though he hadn't gotten them dirty. "Mountain lion, then," I said, because that was the only other predator I could think of that lived out here, and Ronald shook his head slowly. "A lion opens the throat and feeds," he said. "There'd be organs missing, there'd be drag marks where it tried to move the body somewhere quieter. This animal wasn't touched anywhere except the throat, and nothing around here was hungry enough to make a kill and just walk away from it." I asked him what he thought had done it, and he was quiet for long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer, looking instead toward the tree line where the land climbed up into the foothills. I remember laughing a little, not because anything was funny, but because the whole conversation felt like it belonged in one of Frank's superstitious notebook entries, rather than in an actual ranch operation, and Ronald did not laugh with me. A second steer turned up dead 9 days later, this time near the stock tank in the middle pasture, closer to the house than the first, with the same clean wound and the same absence of blood. A week after that it was a calf, found half hidden in a stand of Tremisa brush as though someone had wanted me to have to search a little to find it. And this time Ronald and I found tracks in the soft mud around the tank before the morning wind erased them. 4-toed prints spaced in a way that didn't match any coyote or dog track I'd ever seen, deeper on one side than the other, like whatever made them was heavier than its size suggested, and set unusually far apart, a stride longer than a man's and longer, Ronald said, than any 4-legged animal in the county had any business covering in a single step. I started keeping my own notes after that, not out of any belief that I was dealing with something outside the ordinary, but out of the same instinct that made me keep Laura's grocery list on the refrigerator, a need to write things down so they felt manageable, containable, explainable by daylight even if they weren't explainable at night. I bought a trail camera at the feed store in town, the kind hunters strap to trees to catch deer moving through at dusk, and mounted it on a post near the stock tank. And for 11 nights running it, captured nothing but the ordinary comings and goings of rabbits and a single skunk, until the 12th night when the memory card showed a single frame, taken at 3:14 in the morning, of the camera's own infrared flash reflecting off something pale and low to the ground at the very edge of the frame. Gone by the next exposure 2 seconds later, too blurred and too far at the margin to tell me anything except that something had been standing there, watching the camera watch it. I mentioned the dead calf to the man who ran the feed store in Piedra Seca, an older rancher named Hollis Prout, who had sold Frank his grain for close to 30 years, and who counted out my change with the slow, deliberate hands of a man who had done the same motion 100,000 times. Hollis went quiet in a way I was already learning to recognize the moment I described the wound, setting the bag of feed down on the counter instead of carrying it out to my truck the way he usually did. He told me, leaning against the register with his arms crossed, that he'd lost 2 good cattle dogs the same way 20-some years back, animals he'd raised from pups, found near his own north fence with their throats opened and not a drop of blood anywhere on the ground around them, and that he'd never had another dog since, not because he didn't want one, but because something in him had never quite believed a fence would keep it out a second time. He told me his father used to say that the whole valley sat on what the old Spanish land grant records called a despoblado, an unpeopled place, ground that had a way of staying empty no matter how many families tried to settle it, and that every generation seemed to need to relearn the same lesson the hard way before they either left or figured out how to live alongside whatever it was that didn't want company. I asked him whether he thought it was the same thing that had gotten his dogs, and the same thing that had been at my fence line, and he shrugged in a way that wasn't really a shrug at all, more a refusal to commit the thought to words, and told me only that whatever it was, it had a long memory for which families stayed and which ones left, and that Voss men had a bad habit of being the kind who stayed too long out of stubbornness. He finally did carry my feed bag out to the truck himself that day, setting it in the bed without a word, and as I climbed into the cab he leaned into the open window and told me, quieter than anything else he'd said that morning, that if I ever wanted to just walk away from the whole operation, debt and all, he'd understand better than most people in town, and that nobody would think less of me for it. I called the county extension office not long after that, hoping someone official could tell me I was dealing with an unusually bold mountain lion, or a pack of feral dogs, something with a name and a solution, and the woman who answered pulled Frank's file while I was on the phone with her and told me in a flat, tired voice that my uncle had filed 11 predator complaints over the preceding 6 years, and that none of them had ever been resolved because the county trapper who'd gone out twice had found no den, no scat, no tracks he could positively identify, and had eventually stopped returning Frank's calls. I asked her if any other ranches in the area reported similar losses, and she hesitated before answering. Long enough that I understood the hesitation was itself an answer, and then she said that a couple of the older families out past Rama didn't file complaints anymore, that they'd told her years ago they preferred to handle certain things themselves. I asked her what she meant by that, and she said she really couldn't say, that it wasn't her business to speak for other people's beliefs, and she wished me luck with the herd before ending the call in a hurry that told me she was glad to be done talking to me. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while after that, turning her non-answer over the way I'd been turning over Ronald's, and I remember thinking, with a kind of dread that surprised me by how quickly it had become familiar, that everyone out here seemed to know something I didn't, and that all of them had decided independently and for their own reasons that it wasn't their place to be the one who told me. I spent a few late nights after that doing the kind of research a person does when they no longer entirely trust their own explanations, sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop connected to the slow satellite internet Frank had somehow kept paid up, reading through ranching forums and county agricultural bulletins from as far away as Arizona and southern Colorado, looking for anyone else who had described a wound like the ones I kept finding. Most of what I found was exactly what I expected. Arguments about wolf reintroduction and mountain lion quotas, but buried in an old forum thread from nearly a decade earlier, I found a rancher outside Chinle, Arizona, describing almost the exact same thing: a clean throat wound, no blood at the scene, tracks that shifted from 4 legs to 2 partway across a dry wash, and a string of replies underneath it that alternated between people mocking him for believing in what they called campfire stories, and a handful of other users, careful and terse in the way Ronald had been careful and terse, telling him only to stop posting about it in public and to go speak to someone from his own I emailed a folklorist at a university in Flagstaff whose name I found attached to a paper about regional predator legends across the Colorado Plateau, more out of desperation than any real hope of an answer. And she wrote back 2 days later, polite and academic and careful in a way that told me she knew exactly what I was actually asking, even though I tried to phrase my questions as though I were simply curious about local folklore for a piece of amateur research. She told me that these stories existed, in some form, across a wide stretch of the Southwest, that they varied from community to community, and that she would not presume to explain the specifics of any single tradition that wasn't hers to explain, but that if I was asking because I believed I had encountered something, rather than because I was writing a paper, my best resource by far was going to be the people who actually lived closest to whatever ground I was standing on, not a university office 4 hours away. It was, in its own roundabout academic way, the same advice everyone else had already given me, but before I let myself accept it fully, I tracked down the rancher from the old forum post outside Chinle through a mutual contact at a regional cattlemen's association, and to my surprise he called me back the same week, a tired-sounding man named Gilbert Todachin, who listened to my whole story without interrupting, and then told me plainly that he'd finally solved his own problem 9 years earlier by selling off 2/3 of his herd and simply refusing to run cattle at all on the section of his land closest to the wash where he'd first found tracks, and that in the years since he'd lost nothing, not because whatever it was had left, but because he'd find. He told me he still saw it sometimes, at a distance, standing at the edge of that section of fence on clear nights, and that he had come to think of it less as something he needed to defeat and more as something he needed to stop feeding, in every sense of that word. And he warned me, kindly but firmly, that trying to end it outright, the way it sounded like my uncle and my grandfather both had tried, was a young man's mistake that older ranchers around here had mostly learned not to make twice. I thanked him and hung up feeling less reassured than I'd hoped, because giving up 600 acres of grazing land to something without a name felt, to a man from Tucson 3 months into ranching, like admitting defeat before I'd even understood what I was up against, and it was that same restless, prideful refusal to simply cede the ground, I recognize now, that pushed me toward the confrontation Ronald, and I eventually chose instead of the quieter path Gilbert Todachin had found for himself. Reading his message a second and third time that night, I finally let myself stop looking for an answer that would arrive from anywhere other than the Bar V itself. It was Ronald who finally said the word out loud, though it took him another 2 weeks and one more dead animal to get there. He came out to help me move the surviving cattle away from the north pasture entirely, down into a fenced section closer to the house where I could keep an eye on them, and while we worked, he asked me, without much preamble, whether I'd found anything of Frank's inside the house, any notebooks or letters. I told him about the leather notebook, and something in his shoulders relaxed slightly, like he'd been waiting to find out whether he'd have to be the one to bring it up first. He told me, while we strung a section of fence in the shade of a juniper tree, that his grandmother used to tell him about something called a Yi Nald Lu Shai when he was a boy, a person who had broken a taboo so severe that it changed what they were, someone who could take the shape and the skin of an animal and move through the dark faster and quieter than anything that walked on 4 legs honestly should be able to move. He was careful about how he explained it, choosing his words slowly, and more than once he stopped and said that this wasn't really his story to tell an outsider, that there were things about it that belonged to his people and not to me, but that he'd known Frank long enough and respected him enough to at least warn him, the same way he was warning me now. He told me there were things you were supposed to do if you suspected something like that was around, that you never said its name after dark, that you never looked it in the eyes if you saw it, because it fed on being recognized as much as it fed on anything else, and that ordinary bullets wouldn't stop it, not unless they'd been marked with ash from a proper fire or with something connected to the person it had once been, because underneath the skin it wore, there had once been a person too. He told me, too, that it could not simply walk into a home uninvited any more than it could speak its own true name aloud, that doors and thresholds still meant something to it even now, which was, he said, the only reason either of us was likely to survive the season at all. I asked him, half joking because the alternative was to take it seriously, and I wasn't ready to do that yet, whether he actually believed something like that was killing my cattle. He looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that made the joke curl up and die in my chest, and said that he'd lived out here his whole life, and had learned that some questions were better left unasked out loud, and that Frank had asked them anyway, more than once, and that it hadn't gone well for him. I spent that night doing something I hadn't done since I was a teenager, which was staying up past midnight reading, except instead of a novel I had Frank's leather notebook spread open on the kitchen table with a pot of coffee I didn't need going cold beside it. The entries grew stranger the further into the notebook I read, and stranger still the more recent the dates became. 3 years back, Frank had written about hearing his own name called from the tree line one night, in a voice that sounded almost like his late wife's, close enough that he'd walked halfway to the fence before he caught himself and remembered she'd been dead for 9 years. 18 months back, he'd written about finding tracks in the mud near the stock tank that started as a four-legged animal's prints and then, without any visible transition, became the bare footprints of a man, continuing on in a straight line toward the house before stopping abruptly at the edge of the porch light. There was an entry from just under a year ago, describing a night the power had gone out, for no reason the electric co-op could later explain, during which Frank wrote that he'd heard something moving along the outside wall of the house, dragging what he described only as a low, wet sound, for what he guessed was close to 20 minutes before it finally stopped, and another entry from a few weeks after that, describing a morning he'd found every one of his barn cats gone, food bowls untouched, with no blood and no bodies, and no explanation he was willing to write down beyond a single line that read simply, "It is getting hungrier, and it is getting closer to the house each time." The final entries, written only a few months before he died, described something standing at the fence line on 3 separate nights, watching the house, never coming closer, and Frank's handwriting in those last pages had changed, gotten smaller and more cramped, like a man trying to take up less space on the page or in the world. The last entry in the notebook, dated 5 weeks before the neighbor found his body, read simply that he'd fired 2 rounds at it. The previous week, that he'd hit it. He was almost certain of that, and that it hadn't come back to the fence line since, but that he had a feeling, one he couldn't shake no matter how he tried to reason himself out of it, that wounding the thing had made it worse rather than better. I sat with that sentence for a long time before I finally closed the notebook and went to bed, and I did not sleep. The county coroner's report on Frank's death, which Priscilla Hatch forwarded to me a few days later at my request, listed the cause of death as a fall, consistent with a man his age slipping on the porch steps and striking his head. And I wanted very badly to believe that was the whole truth of it. A sad but ordinary accident. An old man alone on a ranch with nobody to check on him for 6 days. But when I drove into Peter Sika to pick up feed and stopped at the Lariat for lunch, the waitress, an older woman named Connie who'd clearly worked there since it opened, asked if I was Frank Voss's nephew before I'd even sat down, and when I said yes, she got a look on her face I was starting to recognize, the same careful, closed expression Ronald had worn out by the fence line. She told me, lowering her voice even though the diner was nearly empty, that Frank had come in about 2 weeks before he died and sat at the counter for an hour without ordering much, and that he'd told her in a voice she described as scared in a way she'd never heard from him before, that something had been calling to him at night in his wife's voice, and that he was starting to think he wasn't going to make it through the winter. She said she'd told him to call the sheriff or a doctor, and Frank had laughed, not a real laugh, and said that neither one of those would do a damn bit of good against what was out at his place. I asked Connie whether Frank had ever said anything more specific, and she thought about it for a while, refilling my coffee without my asking, and told me that the last thing he'd said to her before leaving that day was that he wished he'd never fired at it, that he thought maybe it would have left him alone eventually if he'd just kept his distance and let it take a cow now and then, and that instead he'd made it personal. I asked Connie, because I couldn't help myself, whether she thought there was really something out there, and she wiped down the counter for a while before answering, and then she told me about the Colton family, who'd owned the Bar V before Frank's father bought it in 1971, a family of 5 who'd simply stopped being seen around town over the course of about a year, until the county eventually sent someone out and found the ranch house empty, furniture still in place, dishes still in the sink, no sign of where any of them had gone. She said the official story was that they'd sold the place and moved on without telling anybody, which was the kind of story people told themselves out here when the real one was too uncomfortable to say out loud in a diner at lunchtime. She also told me, almost as an afterthought while she was ringing up my check, that her own grandfather had ranched 2 sections over from the Bar V back in the 50s, and that he'd once told her the whole stretch of foothills along the north side of that particular valley had a reputation among the old-timers, Anglo and Navajo alike, going back further than anyone still living could properly account for, and that most families who'd lasted more than a generation out there had simply learned the hard way or otherwise which parts of their land to leave alone after dark. I went looking for the Colton family after that, spending an afternoon at the County Historical Society in Grants going through microfiche with a librarian named Barbara, who seemed almost relieved that someone was finally interested in a filing cabinet nobody had opened in years. What I found matched Connie's story closely enough to unsettle me and diverged from it in ways that unsettled me more. There had been a missing persons report filed in 1970 for the youngest Colton son, a boy of 9, last seen walking from the barn to the house at dusk, a distance of maybe 60 yards that he apparently never covered. The search had turned up nothing, no tracks beyond a certain point, no evidence he'd wandered off or been taken by anyone who drove in or out on the single road leading to the ranch. 6 months after that, the rest of the family was gone too, and the newspaper coverage from the time was thin and cautious, quoting a sheriff's deputy who said only that there was no evidence of foul play and no reason to believe anything other than that the family had chosen to relocate without notice, language that felt to me, reading it more than 50 years later, like the same kind of careful non-answer Connie and the extension office woman had both given me. Barbara pulled one more file for me before I left. A shorter one, describing a rancher 2 properties over from the Bar B who had lost his entire herd, close to 90 head, over the course of a single autumn in 1983, and who had sold his land the following spring for a fraction of what it was worth, rather than spend another winter on it, moving his family to Albuquerque and never, as far as the Historical Society's record showed, speaking publicly about why. Barbara also mentioned, almost apologetically, that she'd grown up in Piedra Seca herself, and remembered her own mother telling her never to whistle after dark when they drove past that stretch of road, an old superstition her mother had picked up from a Navajo woman who'd once worked for her family, and that she'd never once questioned it as a child, and still, driving that road at night even now in her 60s, kept her windows up out of habit. Before I left, she dug up one more item at my request, a homestead diary donated to the Society in the 1980s by the descendants of Anglo-settler family who had tried and failed to establish a claim just north of what later became the Bar V, back in the 1890s, decades before any Voss ever set foot in Catron County. The diary's later entries, written by the settler's wife in a careful slanting hand, described losing most of their small herd over a single terrible winter to what she called, without further explanation, a wrongness in the North Hills, and the family had abandoned the claim entirely the following spring. Reading that entry in the quiet of the Historical Society's back room, more than a century removed from the woman who wrote it, I understood for the first time just how far back the pattern actually reached, long before my grandfather, long before the Coltons, long before anyone with the surname Voss had ever laid eyes on that stretch of foothills, and the realization sat in my stomach the entire drive back to the ranch, heavier than anything else I had learned that week. I brought what I'd found back to Ronald a few days later, laying the photocopies out on his kitchen table while his wife made coffee in the next room, and asked him directly what he thought had happened to the Colton boy and to Frank, and whether he thought the same thing was responsible for all of it. Ronald studied the photocopies for a long time without touching them, and then he told me something he said he probably shouldn't, which was that his grandmother had once told him the north pasture on the Bar Fe sat close to a place his people considered wrong ground, somewhere a person had done something terrible generations back and had been changed by it, and that the land itself seemed to remember what had happened there, even after everyone who could tell the story properly had died. He told me this reluctantly, watching my face the whole time like he was gauging how much I could be trusted with, and he finished by saying that whatever it wasn't mine to fix and it wasn't his either, not really, and that the only sensible thing either of us could do was make sure it had no reason to come any closer to the house than it already had. I asked him whether he thought Frank's 2 rifle shots 5 weeks before his death had made things worse. the way Frank himself seemed to fear in that last notebook entry, and Ronald was quiet for a long time before saying that wounding something like this without finishing the job properly tended to make it angrier, rather than driving it away for good, and that he suspected that was exactly why Frank had ended up dead on his own porch steps within 5 weeks of pulling that trigger. I would like to say I listened to him fully and stopped pushing at things after that conversation, but the truth is that I spent the next several nights doing the opposite, sitting up with the lights off and the back door unlocked, telling myself I was simply keeping watch over the herd, when really some part of me wanted to see it, wanted proof of something instead of dead cattle and old notebooks and a diner waitress's uneasy stories. One of those nights, driving back from town later than I meant to after a long conversation with Priscilla Hatch about refinancing the back taxes, I came around the last bend before the washboard turnoff and caught something in my headlights standing at the edge of the borrow ditch, upright, tall, still, gone the instant. The beam swept fully across it, so quickly that by the time I'd brake to a stop, there was nothing on the shoulder but scrub grass and a fence post, and I sat there in the idling truck for a long minute with both hands locked on the wheel before I made myself drive the rest of the way home at a crawl, watching the tree line the whole time. I got what I had been half hoping and half dreading to find on the 9th night after my conversation with Ronald about the Coltons, a Tuesday in early May, when I woke from a doze in the kitchen chair to the sound of my name being called from somewhere out past the barn, in a voice that took me almost a full minute of sitting frozen in the dark to recognize as Laura's. My wife had been dead for 2 years. I had buried her myself, had scattered part of her ashes off a ridge outside Tucson she'd loved, and I sat in that kitchen chair with my heart slamming against my ribs listening to her voice call my name a second time, closer now, with an inflection that was almost right but not quite, like someone who had heard her speak exactly once and was reconstructing the sound from memory rather than repeating it. I did not go outside. I want to say that was courage, or that it was Ronald's warning finally sinking in, but honestly, I think I was simply too afraid to move, sitting perfectly still with both hands gripping the edge of the table until the voice called a third time, closer still, close enough that I could hear something underneath it that wasn't Laura at all, a low, wet clicking sound like a throat that wasn't built quite right for human speech, and then nothing. I sat in that chair until the sun came up, and when I finally made myself walk out to the porch in the gray early light, I found tracks in the dirt at the bottom of the steps. 4-legged animal prints leading up from the tree line that became, 6 feet from the porch, the bare footprints of something with too many toes, standing exactly where Frank's had stopped in his notebook, facing the house. I called Ronald before I'd even made coffee, and he came out faster than he had the first time, arriving with his rifle for the first time since I'd met him, a bolt action that looked older than either of us. He walked the tracks with me in silence, crouching at the point where they changed shape, running his thumb along the edge of one print without touching it directly the same way he'd examined the dead steer weeks earlier. "It's gotten bolder," he said finally, standing up and looking toward the house rather than at me, which meant it had probably fed recently, or it was getting desperate, and neither one of those was good news for anybody living out here. I told him about the voice, about Laura, and something in his face changed, a tightening around the eyes that he didn't try to hide from me. "It uses what it can find," he said. "Memories, sounds, whatever gets a person to open a door or step off a porch, and the fact that it had used my wife's voice specifically meant it had been listening to me, or watching me, closely enough to know what would work." He told me, standing there in the cool morning air with his rifle across his arm, that we had 2 real choices left. We could sell the herd immediately, board up the house, and I could go back to Tucson and let the Bar V sit empty the way it apparently wanted to, or we could try to end it properly, which meant finding out exactly what Frank had done when he fired those 2 rounds 5 weeks before he died, because whatever he'd hit, it clearly hadn't been enough, and doing it wrong a second time might be worse than not trying at all. The very next night, before we had settled on a plan, I nearly lost more than a fence line to it. I'd gone out to the barn a little before 11 to check the water lines to the trough, a chore I would normally have left until morning, but the pump had been cycling strangely all evening, and I wanted to make sure it wasn't about to fail. I remembered the barn felt wrong the moment I stepped inside, a stillness in the air that had nothing to do with the wind outside, and I had just crouched down beside the pump housing with my flashlight when the big sliding door behind me, which I was certain I'd latched, swung open on its own with a long groan of old hinges. I turned the flashlight toward it and saw nothing, just the dark yard and the shape of the house beyond. But the horses in the two stalls at the far end of the barn had gone completely silent in a way horses never do, pressed flat against the back walls of their stalls with their ears pinned. I stood very still, remembering everything Ronald had told me about not being recognized, and I switched the flashlight off rather than sweep it around the barn the way every instinct told me to. In the dark I heard it, a slow, deliberate scrape of something dragging across the packed dirt floor near the far wall, moving without any hurry at all, the way a predator moves when it already believes it has you. I did not run. I do not fully understand, even now, how I managed not to run, except that some cold, clear part of my brain understood that running was exactly what it wanted, and instead I backed toward the door I'd come in through, one slow step at a time, my hand finding the frame before I finally turned and walked, not ran, back across the yard toward the house. The distance between the barn and the porch steps was maybe 40 yards, ground I had crossed 100 times without thinking about it, and that night it felt like 40 yards of open water with something moving beneath the surface, keeping pace with me just out of sight. I heard it behind me twice, not footsteps exactly, but something closer to a low, dry rustle, there and then gone, and each time I felt every muscle in my body scream at me to break into a run, and each time I forced myself instead to keep the same slow, even pace, repeating Ronald's warning in my head like a prayer, because some part of me understood, without being able to explain how I knew it, that the moment I ran was the moment the distance between us would stop being a choice. I made it inside and through the deadbolt and stood with my back against the door for a long time, feeling the whole way there, like there had been a hand an inch from the back of my neck that never quite closed, my shirt soaked through with sweat despite the cool night air. And when I finally worked up the nerve to look out the kitchen window toward the barn, the sliding door stood wide open, and nothing at all moved in the dark beyond it. I did not go back out to check on the horses until well after sunrise, and when I finally did, I found them both still pressed into the back corners of their stalls, trembling, refusing feed for most of that day, and it took nearly a week before either of them would walk past that section of the barn wall without shying sideways. Denise flew into Albuquerque the following weekend, insisting she needed to see the ranch for herself before she would stop worrying about me over the phone, and I picked her up at the airport with a version of events sanded down enough that I thought I could get her through a 3-day visit without either frightening her or lying outright. She loved the place immediately, walking the yard that first evening with her arms crossed against the evening chill, saying she finally understood why I'd given everything up to come out here, and for most of 2 days I let myself enjoy watching my sister fall a little in love with the same wide sky that had pulled me in on my first night. On her second evening, though, while we sat on the porch after dinner, she went quiet mid-sentence and asked me, in a voice gone suddenly careful, whether I'd heard that too. And when I asked her what she meant, she said she thought she'd heard someone calling her name from somewhere near the tree line, a voice she almost placed as our mother's before catching herself, and remembering our mother had died when Denise was 22. I told her it was probably an owl, the kind of lie I had gotten uncomfortably good at telling by then, and I got her inside faster than I probably needed to, latching the door behind us with a firmness that made her look at me strangely. She left 2 days early, citing a work deadline that I suspected didn't exist, packing her bag with a briskness that told me she wanted to be back in her own apartment, with her own ordinary noises outside her own window, more than she was willing to admit to my face. Driving her to the airport, she asked me once, staring straight ahead through the windshield rather than at me, whether I actually intended to keep living out there, and I told her I hadn't decided yet, which was truer than the answer I'd been giving her over the phone for weeks. Though she never said so directly, I understood from the way she hugged me at the gate, holding on a beat longer than usual, that some part of her had felt exactly what I'd been feeling for weeks, and had decided, the way everyone else out here seemed to decide, that it was easier not to say so out loud. She called me twice a week after that, instead of once, and every call ended the same way, with her asking, half joking and half not, whether I was still in one piece. I told Ronald everything once he was back from putting Denise's rental car worries to rest, and I'd walked her through security in Albuquerque, catching him up on the barn that night and on what Denise had heard from the porch, and he listened without interrupting. And when I finished, he said only that I had done exactly the right thing in the barn, that not running and not shining the light directly on it, had probably been the two decisions that got me back inside the house in one piece. He told me that from what his grandmother had described, the thing fed as much on fear and recognition as it did on flesh. That a person who panicked gave it an opening, a person who stayed calm did not, and that the reason it had likely retreated once I reached the door was that a house, particularly an old one built the way the Bar V had been built, with thick adobe walls and doorways blessed, or at least respected, by generations of people who understood what was out there, still carried some measure of protection that open ground did not. He said we had run out of time to be careful about who we asked for help, and that he intended to go speak with a man he knew from Rama, a medicine man his family had known for 3 generations, about what could actually be done for the land itself, not just for one bad night at a time. I asked to come with him, and he said no, gently but firmly, explaining again that this wasn't a conversation I could be part of, that the relationship between his people, the land, and the kind of help that was needed went back generations in ways I hadn't earned any standing in, but that he would come back and tell me whatever I needed to know to protect myself and the house while he worked out the rest. We spent the better part of a week on that arrangement. A search that took Ronald back and forth to Rama, twice while I stayed close to the house, moving what remained of the herd, 23 head by then, into the tightest pasture nearest the barn, and stringing an extra line of fencing around it, out of a fear I couldn't fully justify but couldn't shake either. On the second trip, Ronald asked if I would meet him at the edge of the highway rather than come further onto Rama land myself, and I drove out to shake hands, briefly, with an older man named Herbert Bitsili, who studied me for a long moment without much expression before telling me, through Ronald rather than directly to me, that he was willing to help with the land itself, but that the responsibility for what happened on it afterward would remain mine, since it was my family's blood and my family's name that had drawn the thing's attention across 3 generations in the first place. Herbert was smaller than I expected, quiet in a way that made the silence around him feel deliberate rather than empty. And though he spoke mostly to Ronald in a language I didn't understand, he switched briefly into English twice, once to ask my full name and the date I had first arrived at the ranch, writing nothing down but repeating both back to himself under his breath as though committing them to memory, and once to tell me, looking at me directly for the only time during the whole conversation, that what I was dealing with had likely once been a person who wanted power badly enough to trade something irreplaceable for it, and that the tragedy of a thing like that was not only what it had become but what it still, somewhere underneath the hide it wore, might remember about what it, he told Ronald, who translated this part carefully and with a kind of reluctance I could see in his face, that he would prepare what was needed, but that he would not come to the ranch himself, that his help would end at the edge of his own land, the way it had for Ronald's grandmother's generation and the generation before that, and that whatever happened after Ronald carried the cedar and the ash back to the Bar V was between my family and whatever still walked that valley. I thanked him as best I could, aware of how small and inadequate the words felt, and he nodded once, briefly, before turning back toward his truck, and Ronald told me on the drive back that in his experience that nod was as close to a blessing as Herbert Bitsili was likely to give a stranger, and that I should consider myself fortunate to have gotten it at all. While that longer conversation was happening somewhere I wasn't invited to be part of, I went back through Frank's papers one more time, and in a box I hadn't fully unpacked yet, buried under old tax returns, I found a second notebook, older and more worn than the first, with my grandfather's name written inside the cover instead of Frank's. It turned out my grandfather Frank and my father's father had kept his own record decades earlier, describing an encounter in 1958 that matched everything Frank had written almost exactly: the voice at the fence line, the tracks that changed shape, the low dragging sound along the outside wall of the barn, and a final entry describing a night he'd fired on it with a rifle loaded, on the advice of a neighbor whose name I didn't recognize, with rounds he'd rubbed with ash from a cedar fire before loading. He'd hit it, he wrote, and it had not come back for 11 years, not until Frank started running cattle on the North Pasture again after their father died, which meant whatever this thing was, it wasn't truly killed by being wounded, only driven off long enough for a new generation to forget why the North Pasture had been left empty for over a decade in the first place. One passage near the back of my grandfather's notebook stayed with me longer than the rest, written in a hand steadier than the entries around it, as though he'd copied it out carefully rather than scrawling it in a hurry by lamplight. He had written that a man from Ramah, whose name he'd chosen not to record, told him the thing had likely once belonged to a family from up around the Chusca Mountains generations back, someone who had gone looking for power the wrong way during a hard winter and had never found a way to give it back. And that ground, like the North Pasture, seemed to hold on to things like that, the way a wound holds on to a splinter, long after the skin has closed over it, festering quietly until something disturbs it again. My grandfather had underlined a single line twice, hard enough that the pen had nearly torn the page, which read, "It does not hate us, it is only hungry the way a starving thing is always hungry, and that is somehow worse than hate would be." I sat with both notebooks open on the table, my grandfather's cramped handwriting from 1958, and Frank's from 3 years ago, describing almost the same night in almost the same words, and understood for the first time that I wasn't dealing with a problem that had a solution so much as a problem that had a pattern, one that repeated itself every time a Voss forgot what his father had known and let the North Pasture fill up with cattle again. 2 days before Ronald returned from Rama for the final time, I made the mistake of going up to check the north fence alone in broad daylight, a chore I told myself was perfectly safe with the sun high overhead and nothing in any of Frank's notebooks or Ronald's warnings ever suggesting the thing moved before dark. I had the fence line mapped out in my head, a straight 2-mile stretch running along the base of the foothills, and I was maybe half a mile in on the four-wheeler when I noticed the birds had gone silent, the same unnatural stillness Frank had described feeling around the house on his worst nights, except now it was noon, and the sky was a hard, clean blue without a cloud in it. I slowed the four-wheeler and scanned the tree line out of habit rather than real fear, and that was when I saw it standing motionless between 2 junipers, 100 yards up the slope, not obviously animal and not obviously human, tall in a way that made the trees around it look slightly wrong by comparison, and even at that distance I understood, with a certainty that had nothing to do with reason, that it was looking directly at me. I remembered Ronald's warning about not being recognized and forced my eyes down to the fence line instead, my hands already turning the four-wheeler back the way I'd come, and the moment I did I heard it start moving through the brush toward me, fast, far faster than anything with that kind of frame should have been able to move across broken ground, branches snapping somewhere behind and above me on the slope. I opened the throttle and rode that fence line harder than I have ever ridden anything in my life, bouncing over ruts I would normally have slowed for, the sound of something crashing through brush, closing the distance behind me for what felt like a full minute before it finally seemed to fall back, whether because it lost interest or because the fence line was carrying me back toward the house and whatever thin protection that still offered, I never found out. I did not stop the four-wheeler until I was in the yard with the engine still running, and I sat there shaking for a long time before I trusted myself to walk inside and call Ronald, who told me, in a voice more shaken than I'd heard from him before, that in 15 years he had never once heard of it moving in daylight, and that its willingness to do so now, this close to the house, meant we were running out of whatever time we had left to wait for Herbert Bitzeley's preparations. Ronald came back after those 7 days with instructions rather than a promise. Cedar and ash prepared the way Herbert Bitzeley had described, along with a firm warning, relayed carefully and more than once, that this would only push the thing off the land again, the way it had been pushed off twice before, not end it for good, because whatever had made it what it was had happened somewhere deeper and older than anything a single night's work on one ranch could undo. That would have to be enough, he said, because it was all either of us had, and I agreed, because the alternative was doing nothing and waiting to become the next entry in a notebook some future Voss would find in a box of old tax papers. We picked a night with no moon, and I sat in the kitchen with the lights off exactly the way I had 2 weeks earlier, except this time Ronald sat across from me with his rifle loaded and both of us waiting instead of just me. The hours before it came were some of the longest I have ever sat through, the two of us speaking only occasionally and in low voices, Ronald checking his watch by the dim glow of the stove clock, the small cedar fire he'd built near the porch steps, sending a thin curl of smoke past the kitchen window that I watched more closely than I have ever watched anything in my life. At one point, somewhere close to midnight, Ronald told me quietly about his own father, a man who had run a small herd near Rama for 40 years and who had once told Ronald, when Ronald was still a boy, that the reason he never let his own children wander the far pastures alone after dark had nothing to do with rattlesnakes or getting lost, the excuses he gave outsiders, and everything to do with something his own father had warned him about in turn. Ronald said he'd resented that caution as a teenager, had snuck out more than once just to prove to himself there was nothing out there worth being afraid of, and that the one time he'd actually seen it, at 17, standing at the edge of his family's cornfield in the exact stillness I had described from the barn, he had understood immediately and completely why every generation before him had told the same story instead of laughing it off, and he had never snuck out again. Somewhere around 1 in the morning, even the crickets outside went quiet all at once, the way I'd read they sometimes do before a storm, except the sky outside was clear and full of stars, and there was no storm coming that either of us could see, and Ronald set his coffee down without finishing it and picked up the rifle from where it had been resting across his knees. It came a little after 2 in the morning, and this time it did not use Laura's voice. It used my own, calling my name from somewhere near the barn in a flat, wrong imitation of myself that was somehow worse than my dead wife's voice had been, because it meant the thing had been close enough, recently enough, to hear me talking to myself out on the porch on nights I thought I was alone. Ronald was the one who went to the door, not me, because he said my presence out there would only give it something to reach for, and I stood at the window watching him step off the porch into the dark with the rifle raised, cedar smoke curling up from the small fire he'd left burning near the steps, and for a long, terrible minute I heard nothing at all, no voice, no footsteps, nothing but the wind moving through the junipers. Then I saw it, only for a second, caught at the edge of the porch light before it moved. A shape that was wrong, in a way I still cannot describe properly even now. Tall and too thin, moving on 4 limbs, and then suddenly on 2. Wearing what I understood later, though I didn't let myself fully understand it in the moment, was the ragged remnant of a hide that had once belonged to something else entirely, something that might once have had a name. Ronald fired once, and the shape convulsed and folded in on itself, and was gone into the tree line faster than anything that size should have been able to move, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the sound of the shot had been. Ronald stood on the porch for a long time afterward, rifle still raised, before he finally lowered it and came back inside, and he told me, sitting back down at the kitchen table with his hands not quite steady, that he'd hit it. He was fairly sure of that. We sat together at that table until the sky outside started to lighten, not talking much, both of us listening for anything that might mean it was coming back, and somewhere around 4 in the morning, Ronald told me quietly that this was the first time in 15 years of working this land that he'd actually fired his rifle at it rather than simply watching it retreat on its own, and that some part of him had never fully believed, until that moment on the porch, that a bullet marked with cedar ash could do anything to a thing like that at all. He admitted, in a voice lower than I'd heard him use before, that his own father had told him once that Ronald's grandfather had tried the same thing back in the 1940s on a different stretch of ground near Rama, and that it had worked for almost 20 years before whatever it was found its way back, which meant that even a good outcome that night was, at best, a long reprieve rather than an ending, and he wanted me to understand that clearly before I let myself feel too settled about it. I did not sleep again that night either. But for the first time since I'd arrived at the Bar V, the silence outside felt like an absence rather than a presence, and somewhere around dawn I finally believed, or wanted badly enough to believe, that it was over. We spent the following 2 weeks watching for any sign it had come back, checking the fence lines every morning, and finding nothing, no tracks, no dead cattle, no voices calling from the dark, and by the middle of June I had allowed myself to believe, cautiously, that whatever had been out there was gone. I called Denise that Sunday and told her, in the sanitized version of the truth I'd been giving her for weeks, that things had settled down considerably, that I'd handled a predator problem with the herd and it seemed to be over. And she said she was glad and asked when I'd finally decide the whole adventure had run its course and come home. And I told her I honestly didn't know anymore, because for the first time since Laura died, I had started to feel in fits and starts like a person who might actually want to stay somewhere. I sold the herd 3 weeks later to a rancher outside Quemado who didn't ask why I was getting out of the business so quickly, though he did mention, while we were loading the last of the cattle onto his trailer, that he'd keep them well clear of anything he heard calling to them after dark. a comment he made lightly enough that I couldn't tell whether it was a joke or a habit, and I decided it was probably safer for both of us if I didn't ask him to clarify. I listed the Bar V with a realtor, in Grants, who described it in the listing as a rare opportunity: 640 acres with mountain views and a historic adobe homestead, language that made no mention of the North Pasture or of anything that had ever happened on it. I spent my last week on the property doing the kind of quiet, unnecessary chores a person does when they aren't ready to admit they're finished, oiling hinges that didn't need it, walking the fence line one final time even though there was no herd left to keep inside it, and standing for a long while at the spot near the stock tank where I'd found that first steer back in March, trying to feel something more conclusive than the mix of grief and relief that had settled into my chest by then. The night before I left, I sat out on the porch steps long after dark for the first time since the confrontation with Ronald weeks earlier, not out of any renewed sense of safety, but because I found I wanted, in some complicated way I couldn't fully explain even to myself, to say goodbye to the place properly rather than simply driving away from it at first light. The cedar fire had long since burned down to a cold gray scar in the dirt near the steps, and the tree line sat dark and unremarkable against a sky thick with more stars than I had ever seen from any porch in Tucson, and for the better part of an hour nothing moved out there at all. No voice, no dragging sound, no pale shape at the edge of the light, just the ordinary hush of a working ranch settling in for the night the way it must have settled in for 100 years before I ever arrived and would go on settling in, I hoped, for whoever arrived and would go on settling in, I hoped. BSUD. I thought about Laura's chickens and her garden and the kitchen she never got to paint, and about Frank's small, cramped handwriting in those final notebook entries, and about how strange it was that the same 640 acres could hold both an old man's fear and, at least for one quiet hour on my last night there, something almost like peace. Ronald came out the morning I finally loaded the truck, bringing his wife's cooking in a foil-covered dish I ate cold on the drive back to Tucson because I couldn't bring myself to stop somewhere and let it get cold sitting in a restaurant, and he told me, shaking my hand at the tailgate, that he'd keep an eye on the place for as long as anyone would let him, out of respect for Frank and, he said, for me too now, and that I should call him any time, day or night, if something about the sale ever started to feel wrong. I told myself, driving back to Tucson with the truck considerably emptier than it had been on the way out. I called Ronald once a month or so after I left, mostly to thank him again and to ask, carefully, whether he'd heard anything from whoever bought the ranch, and each time he told me things were quiet, that the new owners hadn't mentioned any trouble with the herd they were slowly building back up, and each time I felt something in my chest loosen a little further. The ranch sold in October to a couple from Albuquerque looking for a weekend property, and I signed the closing papers without once mentioning what I knew, telling myself that was a decision I could live with, that whatever Cedar and Ash had done out there would hold for them the way it had held for 11 years after my grandfather fired his own rifle into the dark. I told myself, too, that a family who wanted a weekend property rather than a working ranch would likely never spend enough nights out there to matter, that they would come for long weekends and holidays and leave the North Pasture alone entirely, and that the particular arithmetic of the Barven 3 generations of Vossmen learning the same lesson too slowly simply wouldn't apply to people with no history on that land at all. I believe that, most days. I think about the decision not to warn them more than I'd like to admit, especially on nights when the phone rings late and the caller-ID shows a number I don't recognize, and more than once in the 2 years since, I have let it ring through to voicemail rather than answer, because on the one occasion I did pick up, there was nothing on the other end but a long, patient silence, and underneath it, so faint I told myself afterward, I must have imagined it, something that sounded almost like my own voice, waiting to see if I would speak first. I settled back into life in Tucson slower than I expected to, teaching again by January, dating a little by the following spring, and for a long while the Bar V felt like something that had happened to a different, braver version of me, a story I could tell in careful, edited pieces at a dinner party without anyone asking the follow-up questions that would have forced me to either lie outright or say something that would make the whole table uncomfortable. Ronald and I still talk every few months, and last winter he told me, in the same careful, unhurried voice he'd used the very first morning I met him, that the family from Albuquerque had started asking around town about the North Pasture. That word travels slowly out there, but it does travel, and that Connie at the Lariat had apparently sat the wife down over coffee one afternoon and told her gently some version of what she'd once told me. I don't know what the wife did with that information, whether she believed it, whether she told her husband, whether it changed anything at all about how they used that land, and Ronald didn't offer to find out further, which felt by then like its own kind of answer. I looked up the Bar V online a few months ago, out of a curiosity I couldn't quite talk myself out of, and found it listed for sale again, the couple from Albuquerque apparently deciding after less than 2 years that ranch life wasn't for them. After all, the listing photos showing the North Pasture empty of cattle and the fence line along the tree line standing in need of repair, and I closed the browser tab without letting myself read any further, because there are some questions I have finally learned, the way Frank learned too late, and my grandfather learned just in time, that are better left unasked out loud. What I have not stopped doing in all the time since is keeping a small leather notebook of my own in the drawer beside my bed, blank except for a single entry I wrote the week I left Piedrasica for the last time, in case one day it finds its way, the way Frank's did, and my grandfather's did before him, into the hands of someone in my family who has no idea yet what those 640 acres are actually worth, or what it costs to hold on to land that has never quite finished deciding it belongs to something else.